Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Amongst the many news items we have for you is a rather embarrassing faux pas by the head of Florida's Department of Health, an update to Damar Hamlin's cardiac arrest on field and how it is most definitively not related to COVID-19 vaccines, despite claims from various sources. A diabetes drug that may, at least in theory, increase your lifespan. The creativity available by using Lego as demonstrated with a cell culture apparatus. A mathematical formula for achieving a male orgasm. Why it is that, at least in theory, early humans had a seemingly easier time not only domesticating plants, but then being able to develop them in more unique and specific ways compared to today. And finally, whether or not we should be really worried about AI. Starting with the embarrassment that is Florida. And sadly, this is not a Florida man example, but rather Dr. Joseph Ladapo, the head of Florida's Department of Health. They recently had a news conference where they were making various claims, but some of these claims were statistics, and you need to be very careful when using stats. The simple expression, lies, damned lies, and statistics exists for a reason. It's because if you use stats correctly, you can distort the truth, but only if others don't have the basic information on which you rely to make those claims. And in this instance, no, COVID-19 vaccines are not more dangerous for men under 40, and the reason this is so embarrassing is that it was debunked by Politico, one of the less reputable news organizations given how slanted they are in their politics. One challenge you will face if you're trying to publish results is that oftentimes successive changes get recorded, and for very clear reasons. That is, you have to have a paper trail that shows how you've responded to criticisms when you're trying to publish something from reviewers, or in some cases they may praise you for it, although that's rather like a unicorn, incredibly rare and practically non-existent. In this case, what happened was that the multiple iterations appeared to involve successive changes to not only the methodology, but the analysis done to try and find evidence that supported some claim that undermined the benefit of vaccines. And that's the issue. The protocol should establish at the start what methods are used to try and investigate what, not go back after the fact and try and find things that are significant. And that's where the problem lies here. They appear to have done what is called p-hacking, and it is just that. It is running your statistical tests on every possible variable you can imagine, and then seeing what is significant. And in this case, by doing that, they're then able to go back and make changes to the protocol and establish that, oh no, we always intended to find this. The problem is that that's not what the original protocol had, and that they didn't report on a number of other findings that were significant that didn't match with what they were claiming. Of course, this is already embarrassing enough. After all, if you can so easily debunk the attempt to show what's happening with what is honestly a relatively simple and easy method, what else follows couldn't be worse. That is, they've selectively chosen periods of time and also removed certain analyses that would see whether or not what they found was actually true by comparison to other groups. And this is basically cherry-picking of data. And to use one of the more notorious studies, you have either the Seralini example, in which case they only chose rats that showed cancer without a control group, or the Wakefield study, in which they only chose 9 out of a much larger group, and that much larger group would have otherwise disproven or gone against the grain of what was being claimed. The most embarrassing element of this, and it is why they really shouldn't have tried doing it this way if they were going to do it at all, is that they claimed that vaccines were more dangerous for those males under 40, but they actually find that looking through the data, when you look at the full data set, not just cherry-picked results, it's actually COVID-19 that has that effect, not the vaccination. The work is so badly botched, and we're honestly surprised they managed to screw it up so badly, that one quoted professional statistician pointed out that it's a lie, and that is, frankly put, rather harsh criticism in such a public manner. It would be rare to see it called out like this without more nuance added to it for political reasoning. In this case, that may be the driving factor, although in this case, we'll attribute incompetence rather than malice to the end result, as it's someone who clearly doesn't know what they're doing or how to do it, or if they do, they're just an idiot. Perhaps Florida man did strike again. Another study this week that also sees itself in trouble, and in fact so bad that it's now been retracted, was the study claiming that nearly 300,000 COVID-19 vaccine deaths had occurred since they were introduced. As you can imagine, having nearly 300,000 people die due to vaccines is, well, to be quite blunt, a shock. Of course, anytime you have numbers in the hundreds of thousands related to death from a single cause, people are going to be horrified, whether that is cancer, vehicles, guns, drugs, or whatever it happens to be. And that's why anti-vaxxers were jumping on this as though it were a gift delivered to them on a silver platter. As you can imagine, such a attractive target for anti-vaxxers also got as much interest from people who actually know what they're doing, and they started looking through what was happening with this publication, and it again had a lot of issues. One of the, let's say, nicer ways to put this is that it had a laundry list of items that had gone wrong. Much like the Florida Surgeon General's study, this was badly designed and badly analyzed. The first and perhaps most apparent concern is that this was written by an economist, not an epidemiologist or anyone else who would be competent in their statistics, at least not in this context. And it's one reason why you should generally try and have somebody who is, if not a specialist, at least competent in the field you wish to publish in as one of the publishers who can provide the necessary input, tell you you're being an idiot, thereby avoiding much of the embarrassment that goes with a retraction. The other issue here is not so much that they embarrass themselves, but it's how they manage to get themselves in such a position. They used a survey, and surveys can be a useful tool, but they are not a incredibly specific tool unless used very well and very carefully. And these were not used carefully or well. The first thing to point out is that they asked the survey participants if they knew someone who had, or they thought, died from vaccines. Yeah, this means that somehow or other they're thinking that somebody can know the intricacies of another individual's health conditions and background, and assumed knowledge that they know that they died from vaccines. You could try and ask if you know somebody who has died from car accidents, and suddenly hugely inflate the number of car accident-related deaths, and you would find that vehicles would be banned in very short order, and that's why this is a very bad method to use. So we start with what is a very badly designed study with a very flawed method that isn't even consistent with the social science study methodology it's meant to be based on. They then tried to prop up this very poorly conducted research by using evidence from the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. This is another issue again, primarily that theirs is fundamentally a record of any and all possible reactions to vaccines. It is a catch-all system that, no matter how loosely or possibly vaguely related an event is to a vaccine, it gets reported. So, for example, if somebody gets a vaccine and breaks their leg the next day, they're not going to include that because there is clearly no relationship. But if somebody has a vaccine and the next day they collapse due to, say, vertigo, they might attach this to vaccines. And that's the problem here. Theirs is, let's say, kindly, very vulnerable to misinterpretation because it is so broad and vague in what it picks up. Imagine it is kind of like the Facebook of medical reporting. Anybody and everybody can throw up whatever random crap ideas they want into it because they think they're related to vaccines, and as a result, you can analyze it and find anything you want to find in there if you're looking hard enough. This then led to the fundamental issue of what they were trying to state based on theirs and the earlier survey that they put out. That is correlation. And as you should know by now, correlation does not equal causation. So even if there's a correlation, you need more than that to establish a relationship, especially given that this was meant to be the supporting evidence for what was already an incredibly badly conducted study. The correlation that they're arguing is even weaker again because, honestly, they can't even claim that. And to call it correlation is the most generous possible attribute we could give it. That's because they don't tell us what the 22% of the respondents that they claim say there was some experience following vaccination actually had. It could have been a headache, or it could have been cancer, or it could have been a broken bone. There are any number of things, and none of these could have any relationship to vaccines. Or it could have been an autoimmune or immunological reaction that was extremely bad, something like an allergy. These could be attributed, but we just don't know which is which because they don't tell us. And that means the study, especially this element of it, simply cannot be used the way they're trying to use it. Based on what we've just described, you would not be surprised here again that it was retracted, but the reasons why are fairly reasonably well laid out in the editor's explanation, although perhaps it doesn't read very clearly to everybody. But once summarized, perhaps you can go back and see what it means. First, that the data didn't support the conclusions reached, which, as we stated, should already be apparent since the next reason. The methodology for the data collection was not only flawed, but egregiously flawed. That the authors could not establish any causality, but given that they were barely able to scrape by with an argument that there was correlation, and even that was being overly generous, that shouldn't be a surprise either. The population of respondents was another issue again, and that is they may not be representative. When you do something like political surveying, you try and get a spread across the political spectrum. This didn't even try and get that spread. The data collection, as a result of that, was deemed inaccurate, and that there wasn't actually ethics approval for this. And this is going to be a big problem for them, since this may get them put into the category of misconduct, since not having ethics approval for something like survey distribution and data collection could be a big issue. That is a series of long rambling explanations as to why recent news is not just stupid, but at least it's somewhat self-correcting. The ongoing issues of Damar Hamlin, slightly less so. The NFL has been going for a long time, and people have become very invested in it. As such, when a player like Damar Hamlin gets a cardiac arrest and as a result is taken off the field, people become very interested in why it happened, and the claims that it was due to vaccines obviously has a greater impact on them than it would on others, as their personal investment in the team and the individual means that they're concerned about that person, and seeing them as a sort of representative of what could happen to them makes them less inclined to be vaccinated. This is not helped when anti-vaxxers start making speculative claims about the cause. The problem is, we do actually know what the cause is now, because he has been diagnosed, and the diagnosis is both amazingly interesting because of its very high improbability, but also because of how badly distorted it was. Hamlin had something that is called commoto cordis. Fundamentally, this is a very, very tiny window of time in which, if somebody gets blunt force trauma to their chest, it interferes with the heartbeat. The window of time is 20 milliseconds within the single second, which is 1000 milliseconds, of a heartbeat. And that's the issue here. That's such a tiny window of time, and the reason for it is, well, gone after the initial impact, that you can only diagnose it by excluding other diagnoses. As such, you can see that this is not a vaccine-related injury, because vaccines don't cause blunt force trauma to someone's chest. That involves another player on the field, with their sports ball. There's another vaccine-related development, although this time, thankfully, completely unrelated to COVID-19, but also still vaccine-related. In Mississippi, a judge has issued a ruling on vaccines, and it has allowed for religious exemptions. The very simple summary of events is that way back in 1979, Mississippi's Supreme Court removed the allowance for religious exemptions for school vaccinations. Therefore, if kids wanted to go to school, at least public schools, they had to be vaccinated. This meant that you could cut off spread of things like chickenpox, hepatitis, and more. A not undesirable thing, especially given the impact that they have on children. This is where a preliminary injunction is so very weird. A much lower court judge has decided to issue a preliminary injunction which brings back into effect the religious exemption. This is the problem for it, in that, legally speaking, the ruling is incredibly flawed and not consistent with the precedent established in the legal system. But unless and until the state appeals to a much higher court, there is no way for anybody to prevent this at present because of the weird ways the American legal system works. Shifting to other drug-related news, but this time looking at a diabetes drug called Metformin. Metformin is used for type 2 diabetes, and it does help. This led to interest thinking that perhaps it could increase the lifespan of individuals. That's back in 2014, obviously, with such research and the idea that people could be adding to a body of literature claiming that it increases lifespan and therefore some degree of fame, more and more research was put into this. The problem for those people is that they weren't finding the same results. It does nothing to increase the lifespan of regular individuals. What it does do is that it increases the lifespan of individuals with type 2 diabetes, which shouldn't be surprising. The fact that the people with diabetes are taking their medication, and its effective medication, live longer, is like saying those who drink water stay alive. No shit. The drug's exact mechanism of action isn't well understood. In fact, the only real proper knowledge we have about it is that it appears to alter the gluconeogenesis system. That is, the production of glucose in your body, but primarily from the liver. When this happens, you get increases to the amount of glucose circulating in your body. When this happens, you get increases in blood pressure, leading to hypertension. You get issues with your kidneys and possibly damage to the nephron within it, leading to things like hematuria or blood in urine because the kidneys are damaged. If this damage builds up, you get renal failure. You then have a variety of other issues to do with the excess glucose in your blood. By preventing the body from making extra unneeded glucose, since the body already can't use what is available without injecting extra or exogenous insulin from the outside, you wind up in a position where you just have this constantly compounding problem. By not making it, the problem isn't as bad, and can be, if not admittedly perfectly managed, greatly reduced by diet and exercise. So in short, no it doesn't, although there's also admittedly limited evidence as to what it does do for those individuals who don't have type 2 diabetes. What we do have evidence on is chronic Lyme disease, which is, for the most part, an imaginary disease. Lyme disease is real. Chronic Lyme disease is not. There is practically no way to diagnose or prove chronic Lyme disease. And as a result, when people try to treat chronic Lyme disease, it often leads to the actual underlying cause being ignored. And that's what happened in this particular case study, where a young woman had lupus, not chronic Lyme disease. However, her doctors kept trying to treat her chronic Lyme disease, and this ignored all the mounting evidence that she had a form of chronic lupus. Well, all lupus is chronic, but this was a specific kind called systemic lupus erythematosus. This ignorance or decision to focus on another imaginary disease meant that she got in worse and worse condition until eventually dying. Remembering that she died at age 37, but at age 23, so 14 years earlier, she was prescribed the use of immunosuppressive drugs. Drugs that would have dealt with her lupus to some extent. Doing this would have essentially cut off the development of her condition to the state it was in when she died, but she refused, opting for the diagnosis of chronic Lyme disease. The treatment for Lyme disease is the use of antibiotics, and this is one reason why Lyme disease is a acute, not chronic disease when treated. Unfortunately, the internet being the great place it is, led to her going down the pathway of Lyme disease, getting constantly tested, and then getting treatment for Lyme disease. The treatment being tetracycline antibiotics. These antibiotics have a downside, and it is a very significant downside. They can induce lupus. Yeah. So she now had not only the original diagnosis, but also this, if she didn't already have it, could have easily led, and ultimately arguably did lead, to drug-induced lupus. This is made all the more frustrating because serologies were done, and they showed that the organism responsible for Lyme disease was not present. That means continuously treating them for Lyme disease was not appropriate medical practice. In positive news, or at least creative news, it's the creation of a machine that can conduct cell culture using Lego. Lego, for most people, is seen as a child's creative toy, something where you assemble a few fairly limited range of blocks, and from these you're able to make various shapes, imaginary structures, and so on. This is not necessarily the case, as once you start getting into the higher end of Lego, some of the collections are not only well beyond the wallet of children, but also many adults. It doesn't mean that you can't make do with more basic parts and buy them that way, leading to the development of devices like this. That is a machine that can provide a lot of the necessary, let's say, access mechanisms and movements that would allow you to develop a entirely functioning tissue creation machine. In this case, the creation of human skin. Where this gets to be arguably very much amazing is that the reason they've created this is not just because it's interesting, but because it allows them to do what is called 3D bioprinting, which is fundamentally the same as regular FDM or even SLA printing with a 3D printer, except that it's using human or animal biological cells and allowing them to be built up into what is arguably a reasonable analog of real human tissue. This sort of approach is a massive step up over what is arguably the most common method of cell culture at present, which is just a 2D or single layer thick cells in a cell culture container. Think of it as being much like a petri dish, and the bacteria growing on its surface. With the use of 3D printing, you're able to create what is a very similar, if not comparable, model for real, either healthy or diseased tissues. That is where this device becomes so much more amazing. To create something like this, you may be looking at a few $1,000s in terms of all the Lego, given how much they can cost at times. For a, let's say, professionally or commercially made version of this, you're looking in tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And to be quite blunt, very few laboratories can afford that kind of expense. It's simply unrealistic. Grant money only goes so far, and a laboratory might be lucky if they have benefactors who give them extra money. But overall, spending that amount on something that is a single device that will take time to return the yield may not be possible. Or if it's even possible to be able to do that, they may not be able to afford it. Making your own solves all of the basic issues there. Although we say a few $1,000s to make this, the actual price was sub $1,000, about 600 American dollars, although since this is a UK-based university, it cost them £500. And it cost them that much because they had to have a level of precision. Admittedly, if you're not looking to get that kind of precision, you might be able to make it for less, although at that point you are sacrificing accuracy for cost, and given the relatively small cost of this device, it seems a poor trade-off. Another human-related study, although this one goes back about 3,600 years, and is perhaps the oldest drug test ever conducted. The hair that was analysed for drugs revealed traces of the use of hallucinogenics in Bronze Age Europeans. So even before we had properly established civilization, humans were already getting stoned. Well, stoned in a term of drugs, they were probably also using the other form of stoning as well. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell us exactly what the cavemen were getting high on, but we do know what the active ingredients were: atropine, scopolamine, and ephedrine. The first two are known to induce hallucinations and alter your sensory input. The last, ephedrine, is known to increase excitement and alertness. The researchers suspect, although they can't specifically name what plants it came from, as being possibly mandrake, henbane, thornapple, joint pine, and a few others that are most likely, but they can't specifically say what it was. It is suspected that it was some kind of ritualistic usage, rather than just being for the fun of it. Next we go to what seems like a weird mixture: mathematics and the male orgasm. There is the joke that mathematicians are perhaps the most boring people in the world, and that they would be doing research into this. Both does and does not support that argument. The mathematicians spent their time trying to map the best way for a male to achieve an orgasm. While this may sound like the adult episode of Science Fell in Love, so I tried to prove it, it's not exactly that. They were looking at the physiological and psychological arousal needed, and the conditions to achieve that. On second thought, this might actually be an episode that we haven't seen yet. In a somewhat ironic take, the summary by the mathematicians as to the best advice they can offer is don't overthink it. Given that mathematicians developed incredibly complex mathematical models to try and figure out the best possible solution, not overthinking it is, if not hypocritical, definitely ironic. There are, of course, a variety of, let's say, limitations as to what is and is not happening, but ultimately the results aren't going to change hugely. Next we move on to some more drug-related news, but the decision by SCOTUS on Mifepristone, which is an abortifacient used in America for, abortions. The process so far has been something of a roller coaster ride with ups and downs. The gist of it is that a lawsuit was brought against the FDA through a judge that claimed they had not followed the correct avenues for this. The issue with it was fundamentally that they claimed the FDA had not followed the technical requirements, even if they had followed the proper procedural requirements. The problem being that being technically correct in the court of law is better than being just correct. This has led to something of a stay on the drug. That stay was appealed, and as a result of that, the drug was again not held up, but it was allowed to be used once more. Then a new injunction came out, and that new injunction was then appealed to SCOTUS. The reasoning behind the various legal cases, and the one that's been successful so far, is that the FDA has not only changed conditions for the provision of the drug, but how it can be provided. The changes include extending the time frame for it to be available from, going from initially 49 days to now 70 days, lowering the number of in-office visits, and allowing it to be sent via mail. All of these are the technically correct grounds for the other parties that are trying to stop the FDA from allowing it to be used the way it is to go to court, which is the issue here. It is a technically correct, if not necessary, lawsuit. The ruling by SCOTUS at this point, and understand that this is not a final ruling, is that they've removed the very first court's injunction preventing it from being distributed, which fundamentally takes us back to where we were in terms of the drug's availability and ability to distribute it to before the first judge ruled. This ruling, however, is not a complete consensus across the board. Rather, two of the Supreme Court justices, Alito and Thomas, have dissented. The problem is, we don't know why or how SCOTUS has decided to allow it to continue to be distributed as it was being under the FDA's new rules. We do, however, at least have an understanding from the dissension as to why it is Alito and Thomas did not agree with the other members of SCOTUS. The three reasons are that the court, and specifically Alito, has said that the FDA will simply ignore their ruling if they were to not issue the ruling that removed the injunction, and therefore there was an issue with violating the law in those terms. That there was an unclean hands argument with regards to precedent that had been made, and finally that there was an emergency injunction request, and as such the court is not yet fully briefed on what is happening. The issue with that is that an injunction, especially an emergency injunction like this, is that it's intended to exist solely to prevent harm that could not be reversed otherwise. In this case, preventing an abortion is, in a way of saying, a permanent harm, in that somebody who is either ill-equipped, unready, or unwilling to have a child would now arguably be forced to do so without the availability of the drug, although that is an extreme take. Next we move on to crops, and specifically why cavemen and then eventually early agriculture seem to have a easier and better time of being able to create something suitable for them. Consider how many kinds of brassicae are available, and that they initially started from something that was very simple, very crude, and had almost nothing to it that was edible. How is it that early cavemen and then early agriculture could do so? The very short and abbreviated version of the research is that because of the initially very strict requirements for wild-type crops to germinate from seeds into, well, what is essentially something that can be harvested, there's a lot of difficulty in doing that. But once you clear land and start planting them out, they very quickly start adapting to the much looser requirements needed to get these plants to grow more readily, more quickly, and more reliably. The researchers themselves state that within 4 seasons of trying to domesticate a very early precursor to what we now view as something like buckwheat, they were able to get it to shift its window of time and the requirements for germination to a significant degree. In technology news, we have an interesting article from the Neurologica blog, and it talks about how things like highways could be used for a number of different purposes, not just transport, but as a pipeline for all of the things you need in life: water, electricity, internet, and so on. It is worth us pointing out that the blog post in question is largely talking about a theoretical with a very tiny and relatively inconsequential proof of concept, but it is a proof of concept that ticks off one of the things that the authors that the blog post is talking about are trying to achieve. And as the authors themselves write, we envision combining the transport of people and goods and energy transmission and storage in a single system. Such a system, built on existing highway infrastructure, incorporates a superconductor guideway, which outside of the quote is a maglev. Inside the quote again, we have allowing for simultaneous levitation of vehicles with magnetized undercarriages for rapid transport without schedule limitations and lossless transmission and storage of electricity. Incorporating liquefied hydrogen additionally allows for simultaneous cooling of the superconductor guideway and sustainable energy transport and storage. This means that they're not only looking at the ability to transport people, but goods, effectively creating what is a giant train network without the need for individual trains, but rather individual transport of carriages and the ability to transport on the same sort of carriage network. The same thing as a road, or a highway in this case, but with all of the benefits of the increased capacity of the rail network. The same network, given its nature, would also be able to move electricity, and hydrogen is for the most part, entirely renewable fuel, but it would also have the added benefit of being heated by virtue of the energy and heat created from the transport system, but would also then be burnable at the end, meaning that you never have to worry about cycling the hydrogen. This is a concern with, say, power plants now. They need to be constantly cooled with water coming in to provide the necessary heat reduction and condensation of turbines. Overall, the idea is really interesting and kind of cool. Well, cool in that it needs to be at minus 268 degrees Celsius and a ridiculously low number of freedom units, but cool as well in terms of it's actually something that could be at least theoretically feasible by comparison to some of the other proposals. For example, the Lyme. The file also from the Neurologica blog, and it talks about AI and whether or not it's time to worry about AI. It starts with a fairly consistent argument that we fully support. That is, it can be a very powerful tool, but it can also have unintended consequences, just as with any tool. There are a range of machine learning programs now that allow you to recreate an individual's appearance and voice and have them say or do what you wish. This could lead to some very worrying developments with deep fakes. What we don't agree with is that their estimation that people are overestimating the abilities and strengths of AI. We disagree. We do think that in the very near future that AI will become much more capable. While something like ChatGPT can be abused to some extent, it's not as vulnerable as it was only a few weeks ago, and those vulnerabilities are closing in very quickly. We also have iterative developments on the memories of an AI system, as we described last week, where you could put in a single stimulant, that is, the intention to have a Valentine's Day party, and that one character could then lead the other characters to who want to do the same thing, and then they would develop from that memory the impetus to ask others again. And that creates a cascade. And that is the core issue we have here. It's not just AI as we know it now. We need to look at it as being a logarithmic growth rather than a linear growth in AI's ability. That's because AI is not something that's going to build incrementally the way many people think. Rather, each successive development was going to speed up the next in many respects. We do think in terms of the observable output that it is entirely possible that AI will be hitting a plateau soon, but that plateau will be interesting in terms of what it is and where. Once AI is able to start developing some degree of coding ability and developing the necessary skill sets, knowledge, and ability to be able to write extensions to itself or extensions to other applications, you will find that that plateau will disappear just like that. Whether or not we need to be concerned about that is a different question, as a narrowly confined AI with very specific abilities, which isn't a true AI, but perhaps what most people are thinking of, is something that we can handle. It's once they start going outside the scope of being narrowly confined. At present, ChatGPT is largely a question and answer machine able to summarize things. This is great, as you're not exactly having to stress about what it is able to do beyond that. But once it can start making changes outside of itself, that's when you need to worry. The last news item we have for you this week is about SpaceX's facility and its most powerful launch to date. Its Starship mega rocket tried launching off on the 20th of April. This rocket would have been able to carry an incredible amount of resources into space, and arguably be able to bring them back. It was relying on the largest rocket that SpaceX has, the Super Heavy booster, which had more than 24 engines strapped to it. The rocket launched, for the most part, but it had one major downside. It destroyed the launch pad, and it also sent rubble raining on a town 5 miles, or roughly 8 kilometers away. By itself, that's already a pretty bad result, but the rocket did at least get off. The problem with it is that about 40 kilometers or 24 miles up into the air, the rocket failed to separate from its boosters and it proceeded to explode. The FAA is investigating this for what it has just called a mishap investigation. While that investigation is conducted, the entirety of SpaceX's fleet will be grounded. The understood explanation at present is simply that the force required to launch the spaceship was simply much too powerful for the launch pad from which it was launching. As you can see, the explosion wasn't something simple. It led to rubble hitting the fuel storage tanks located in the background. Large tanks full of very explosive fuel that could have exacerbated the problem. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.